How bad is actually playing on PAL? So when I bought my Super Famicom, I wanted basically NTSC, and I also bought an adapter so I can play SNES games as well in English. It's not the only reason, but one of the main reasons I didn't want a PAL console, although I ordered a PAL SNES one as well, which will be coming soon. Now back in the days, the 80s, early 90s, I was gaming on PAL, and of course when it comes to PAL, we all know, or we get to know, that this is the single most important technical distinction to understand, because it defines the speed, the resolution, and even color accuracy of the games you play on original hardware. It will also dictate certain compatibility between your console and your TV, and games between your console. It can also lead to either indirect compatibilities. For example, if you buy a certain console from the US, an NTSC one, you don't want to connect it to your electric outlet if you are, for example, live in Europe. And of course, there are lots of differences. For example, NTSC is 525 total lines, PAL is 625 total lines. And since most games were developed using NTSC's 240 line height, porting them to PAL resulted in black borders, shown in there, for example, in the simulation here. And unless the developer manually added more background art, it's just gonna appear like black borders. So in the case of Sonic 1, for example, you can see on there running on the Sega Master System PAL, you can see that the developers added a background color, so it kind of look more natural rather than going with black borders. So it kind of blends well with the sky color and the bottom, and different scenes the color will be different. So think about it like NTSC is kind of like a small page with only 525 lines to color, and PAL is a large page with 625 lines to color. So again, just an analogy. So if you take, for example, again, it was designed for the small NTSC page, again in quotation, and put it on a large page, in this case the PAL, the game doesn't know how to color those extra lines, so it just stays in its original size in the middle of the screen. But the question that I asked myself when I first saw it, well, I mean, why not actually spread the drawn lines across the line so it will actually fill the screen? Well, there are several reasons for that. First of all, the speed is fixed. I mean, an analog TV doesn't know how tall the picture is, it just follows the speed limit. So it draws from top to bottom in exactly 1/5 of a second. It moves at a constant, steady speed, and it cannot slow down just because it has less data to draw. And of course, it doesn't have memory. It cannot save the image, stretch it, and then show it. It doesn't work like that. So basically, the gap is just waiting. So the TV tried to spread the 525 lines across the 625 line space. It would have to move slower. If it moves slower, it would no longer be in sync with the 50 Hz. Now, the game console sent 240 lines of data. In the NTSC world, the TV is timed so that 240 lines take up the whole screen height. Now in the PAL world, the TV beam is moving over a taller canvas, which is 625 lines, and when the console finishes sending its 240 lines, the PAL beam hasn't reached the bottom of the TV yet. It just keeps moving through the empty space until the next frame starts. Now I asked myself, how does it know to do it exactly in the middle? I mean, why it doesn't draw it from the very top? I mean, in PAL, when you see it in the middle. Well, basically this is hard-coded math that is done again in the PAL console to speak with the PAL compatible TV. So when a company like Nintendo or Sega, for example, releases a PAL version of their console, they changed the internal timing chip to match the European math. So they didn't need to see the screen, for example, because the math was for every PAL TV in the world was the same. So it's all about timing. So a PAL TV takes 20 milliseconds to draw one full screen, that's the 50 Hz, and the engineers knew the game only had enough data to fill about 60 milliseconds of the time. So the calculation was, taking the 20 milliseconds in total minus 60 milliseconds from the game, which equals 4 milliseconds of empty time. So to make it look centered, they decided to put half of the empty time at the top and the other at the bottom. Now, if you play games, PAL games, and they appear kind of squashed, it's about the line density and what to do with the rest of the undrawn content. Now, because PAL screen is built to fit more lines into the same physical height, the space between the active lines is smaller. And this makes the image look denser or more solid. It also makes the individual gap between the scan lines harder to see. Now, most games were designed for NTSC for 240 visible lines. So when you play these games on a PAL TV which has 288 visible lines, that's why you get those black bars, but sometimes the game fills it up with a single solid color. Now ask yourself another question. I mean, they can be different TVs, let's say same TVs PAL region that just have different scanline heights. So this can also affect how characters will look. They might look different on each TV. Now I can also say things regarding phosphor stripe size in this case, beam focus, beam current, mask aperture grill design, how much the beam blooms, and so on. So it wouldn't change yet. This is because the height of the image is electrically predetermined. Every CRT received the signal must draw the same number of scan lines, of course regardless of how thick or thin the phosphor lines appear. So electrically the character's height is identical on both TVs. Now aside from that, regardless of how thick the beam is, the area it is forced to cover is determined by the TV's deflection coils. And these magnets pull the beam from the top left to the bottom right of the glass in a set of 4:3 aspect ratio pattern. So let's say same NTSC signal, just two different tubes. The starting point is the same, because again the start and stop points of the image are physically fixed to the edge of the 4:3 aspect ratio tube, and whether the lines filling the space are fat or thin doesn't change where they start when they start or end. Now the exception I mentioned of course is for PAL and NTSC, which basically the signal tells it how the TV how to fill that space, because the PAL TV is expecting 288 visible lines in order to fill in its 4:3 aspect ratio frame. Now having said that, the character may appear slightly different due to the optical effects, but not actually be taller or shorter. Now as I mentioned, many of these Japanese American developers in the 80s and 90s just developed their games for NTSC. And the PAL market like Europe and Australia was a secondary thought, let's call it like that. Now I also read that because in the 8-bit and 60-bit area, game logic was often tied directly to the vertical blanking interval, the V-blank, the moment the electron gun finishes a frame and resets to the top, and there was kind of a math problem. So let's say if your character moves like 2 pixels per frame at 60 Hz, they move 120 pixels per second. Now at 50 Hz, they only move 100 pixels. Now to make them feel the same, you'd have to change the math, think like let's say 2.4 pixels per frame. But many of the early consoles like the NES for example couldn't handle fractional movement easily. So it would require rewriting a huge chunks of the physics engine just for one region. Now basically it's a solution that worked, it didn't crash, and of course colored work. And it was, well, let's say call it good enough to ship. And in fact, back days, of course, there wasn't internet, so most PAL gamers, including myself, had no idea that their version, for example, of Sonic or Street Fighter or whatever game actually was around 17% slower. And of course, there was a way to see things, of course, if you fly abroad or watch TV or something like that. But in most cases, I don't remember that actually being a thing. Remember that pay attention to it. Now, aside from that, I also read that on a console like the NES and the SNES, the CPU speed was actually tied to the video frequency. So a PAL SNES literally runs its processor slightly slower than the NTSC one. So developers couldn't just, like flip a switch or something. They were actually like fighting the physical clock speed of the console itself. Now when it comes to colors, there's a difference of course between PAL and NTSC, and quite significant. I mean this is why NTSC earned its famous nickname never twice the same color. Now PAL was designed specifically to fix NTSC's color drifting, so it reverses the phase of the color signal on every other line. And this clever trick allows the TV to cancel out any color errors automatically. If the signal gets slightly distorted, PAL stays accurate. NTSC on the other hand, sensitive to signal interference, like for example weather or long cables, and this interference shifts the phase, causing skin tones for example to turn green or purple. And this is why NTSC's TVs have a tint hue knob, so you can manually adjust the colors back to normal. Aside from that, NTSC uses a color space called YIQ. It was designed around the fact that the human eye is more sensitive to certain colors, like the orangey flesh tone range, than others, like purples and greens. So by prioritizing bandwidth for flesh tones, NTSCs can look incredibly natural and warm when properly calibrated. PAL, on the other hand, uses YUV. This is technically more balanced across the spectrum, which often results in a cooler or more clinical colors. Now, for example, on a Sony Trinitron, the CRTs that I have, red is often the kind of trouble color, and it's more prone to red blooming, where, by the way, I noticed it when I actually inspected up close, where, for example, high saturation reds look like they are vibrating or glowing past their borders. And PAL generally handles high saturation colors with more stability, although it also depends on the connection. It sometimes can suffer from dot growth, for example, like these zipper-like artifacts on the edges of colors if you're using a standard composite cable instead, let's say, SVD or component. So from what I read, I perceive that, again, PAL delivers a higher color accuracy. It's kind of self-correcting compared to more variable results that sometimes need manual tuning like NTSC. In terms of color detail, it might be slightly lower on PAL because of vertical averaging, and NTSC should be slightly higher. But again, unless you are really looking up close, you probably won't notice it. The saturation is very stable on PAL, where it can, on NTSC it can bloom or bleed, especially on the reds. The other thing that I think could be even deal breaker for some, and I already read this in the comments, this is the flickering. With PAL, of course, running at 50 Hz, flickering is much more noticeable compared to 60 Hz. Now I can tell you that even on my PVM, my Sony PVM, where the bloom is much more tamed, it's still quite noticeable. Now also because of the difference, motion smoothness should be better on NTSC compared to PAL. Now, if we're not just talking about games, of course, PAL has a higher vertical resolution image, but then I mean more horizontal lines through the vertical space. And some people might prefer it for a film-line look and more detailed results compared to the NTSC, which some would prefer it for fast motion, broadcasting, and so on. The higher resolution of PAL also gives it more headroom for upscaling, scanline simulation, and clear digital capture. And again, not just video games, I'm saying where it's actually applicable. And when it comes to retro gaming, by the way, there are some games, there are very few that were designed to make use of the extra vertical space. So if you have a PAL console, maybe you should check it out. You know, again, there are a few games, but some of them might actually, you know, if they take advantage of the PAL, it can actually be really good. Also, from what I read, many Amiga, Commodore 64, Atari ST, again, I mentioned also some PS1 games were designed for PAL timing. But for me, based on my experience, and I play now on both, I can say that definitely for fast action games like fighters and platformers, shoot 'em ups, racing games, 60 Hz is the way to go. Yeah, interesting stuff. Again, if you have anything to add, please do so in the comment section below. I share as I go and as I learn. Hopefully you find this one interesting. If so, make sure to subscribe to my channel, and more videos, interesting videos are coming. Thanks for watching.